So, as the 19th century ends, populism, an anti-elitist movement attempting to unite poor whites and blacks in the South gets defeated. The economic elite are fanning the flames of racial hatred in the strategy of divide and conquer, depriving African Americans of the right to vote through various means. And the system of legally mandated racial privilege was approved by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And they state that it's constitutional for states to require separate facilities for African Americans as long as the separate facilities were fully equal. So that we know this as separate but equal. This ruling stands up into Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And you can see how racism is becoming institutionalized in the United States. It's being codified in our laws. It becomes law. So to not do that would literally put you in defiance of the law itself. So under de jure segregation, as with slavery, the subordination of African Americans was reinforced and supplemented by an elaborate system of racial etiquette. So not only was it placed in the law itself, but it was also encapsulated in the social norms of the time. Of course, transgressions against this system often resulted in death by lynching. So if, for example, an African American talked back to a white person, well, that could get you lynched. Lynching meaning drug out of your house by a group of people intending to hang you from the closest tree and then possibly burn your body when it was all said and done. Or maybe burn you while they're hanging you. Of course, secret organizations like the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan were often the perpetrators of violent terrorism against African Americans. And as de jure segregation and Jim Crow settles in, we see levels of prejudice and discrimination skyrocket. Or maybe just return back to the way they were when slavery was the law of the land. You have to remember that the KKK, whether it's historically or today, has been constructed and continues to be constructed as a violent hate group. You might see people that they might not belong to the KKK, but they share their same ideals. This type of hate, even though it's not as predominant as it was in the past, still exists in the United States. So if you want to think about a comparative focus, systems of legalized state-sponsored racial segregation similar to Jim Crow can be found in other nations. South Africa is one of them. African apartheid and Jim Crow protest movements formed in the black communities and helped end the systems of racial segregation. The protests were met with extreme violence and repression from the state, and the ensuing struggles created heroes such as Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. It's predictable, folks, what will happen when the minority group that has been the minority group decides that it it no longer wants to be the minority group, and it starts to stand up for itself. Especially when much of this hate has been codified into the law. You will see the state use its full force to prevent this minority group from gaining a voice and making strides to change the situation. And you will also see at the social level a pushback from the dominant group to ensure they remain dominant. And it will be the state and it will be the dominant group that is the most likely group that brings violence, not the protesting group. Those protesters don't want any violence at all. All they want to do is raise attention to their position. They don't want to engage in violent action with anyone, especially the state, because the state possesses the only legal means of the use of force, and they can use it pretty much at will. So we accept the fact that African Americans lack power, but they did have one option that had not been available under slavery, and that was the freedom to leave the South. This creates what we refer to as the Great Migration, as African Americans leave the South. Essentially, you can almost think about it in reference to they're moving up the Mississippi River, or they're moving up the eastern coastline. And they're landing in places all along that path. Some think that ultimately, even though African Americans were not allowed to participate politically in the South, they made their votes count with their 2 feet. They got up and they left. And by moving out of the South and from rural to urban areas, Black political power begins to grow and eventually provides many of the crucial resources that essentially drive the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. This is a graph of the changing dynamic from 1890 to 2010, the percentage of African Americans living in urban areas. As you can see, the number increases over time. This is a bit deceiving because if you look at whites, it probably looks like that as well. The vast majority of the people living in the United States now live in what is designated as an urban area, whether that's African Americans or whites or Asian Americans, Hispanics. Not quite sure about Native Americans, but the vast majority of us live in the city. So, of course, life in the North is better for the vast majority of Black migrants, but it was not the utopia that they hoped it would be. Just because sentiments towards equality were probably higher in the North doesn't mean that the North wasn't as segregated as the South was. So along with freedom and such cultural flowerings as the Harlem Renaissance, also you see the first Black ghettos. And of course, new forms of oppression that, while different from the South in reference to that they're much more subtle, they still have devastating impacts. some folks, some African Americans almost appreciated the South as they moved to the North, because at least in the South, a Southerner would let you know exactly where they thought, or exactly what they thought about you, and not think about it twice. But in the North, somebody might act like they're your friend, but then stab you in the back. The arrival of African Americans into the North creates a problem in immigration. European immigrants groups saw the newly arriving African Americans as a threat to their status. So you can imagine there's a conflict that's going to happen between these groups. White ethnic groups respond by developing defensive strategies to limit the dangers presented by these southern migrants. Probably very much in line with whites only hiring. I don't know if there was white only unions, but you can imagine how they tried to put roadblocks into the way of this new group of people that is coming from the United States and moving northward. Ironically, the newly arriving African Americans helped white ethnic groups to become upwardly mobile, because once again there's a lowest group now, a new low group, which in turn is going to allow for that latest immigrant group to begin, especially if they are not of color, to move upward into the positions that pay more and give them more opportunities. So now we're going to have to start talking about what are the origins of black protest. You can imagine, with this increased freedom that follows slavery, you see the beginnings of a national black leadership that founds organizations that eventually help lead the fight for freedom and equality. But what freedom and equality were you talking about? So when we think about the black protest movement, we have to accept that the viewpoints were much more diverse than we give them credit for. It wasn't this unified whole. Booker T. Washington, an important African-American inventor and college professor and voice in the struggle for civil rights, he argued for accommodation. Just accept your place and move up as you go forward. So he's accepting the idea that assimilation is most likely possible, but you just have to start down low and work your way up. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, who helps found the NAACP, he argues that we need to struggle for civil rights. So use the legal system that's at hand to gain rights and reparations to improve the overall status of African Americans. And then, of course, characters like Marcus Garvey, they just believe that the groups are better off being separate, and we can cohabitate in our own groups and interact through trade and things like that. But he buys into the idea of maybe not separate but equal, because that wasn't equal, but the idea that African Americans are better served by being separate from whites.